I'm happy to be here on this wonderful trail in the Bitterroot Mountains, and I've spent the last 20 years living here in the Bitterroot Valley, and I've spent a lot of time as an outdoor and environmental educator exploring the meaning of connecting to place and what does it mean to develop a sense of place. I'm excited to share this trail with you as we're getting to one of my favorite overlooks on this beautiful spring day with my old ancient Zephyr dog.
Hi folks, my name is Chris and I'm the artist and co-founder at Explorer Maps. My brother Greg and I produced our first map about 11 years ago, doing the map of Montana, and our list of maps has grown from 1 to our current tally of over 65.
Which map will you get to help you treasure your own special times? Please be sure to use the promo code Mandela for a discount when you visit explorermaps.com.
Welcome to The Trail Less Traveled, an adventure radio series and podcast dedicated to collecting stories and sounds from around the world in order to take you back to mankind's earliest form of entertainment, storytelling. This episode was recorded on location in collaboration with Explorer Maps. Missoula, Montana is a mecca for outdoor enthusiasts, and each week we will bring you tales of adventure from both near and far, as well as information and inspiration and a few tunes to set the mood. You can subscribe to the podcast and learn about our international outreach projects at traillesstraveled.net. And now, here's your host, international expedition guide, conservationist, and yogi, Mandela.
Today, The Trail Less Traveled is being recorded in the Bitterroots. Go into detail in a moment where we are sitting right now and what we're looking at. But right now I'm sitting on a rock next to Paul Belanger. He is an educator and a guide, a naturalist, a travel professional, and the owner of Bitterroot Alpine Guides. Paul, thank you so much for your time and energy joining me here today on The Trail Less Traveled.
Thank you, Mandela. It's great to be here.
Will you describe to the people listening what you are looking at right now?
Yeah, so we're at one of my favorite spots in the Bitterroot. I always call this hike the best bang for your buck hike because you come up to this overlook and you're looking into one of the glacier-carved canyons that makes the Bitterroot Range quite famous. This is the Belanger Canyon, and across we're on the south side of the canyon, and on the north side of the canyon are the impressive rock walls and rock faces that I think a lot of people in the climbing community are familiar with, and they're just overly impressive to look at. And it looks just like the geologists say a glacier-carved canyon should look. It's got a U shape to it, and we can only see a few miles up it, but it curves around to the side, and at the head of this is a mountain cirque with lakes, and just one of my favorite places to come to. It's just a short drive from Hamilton and a good place to be.
Beautiful. Paul, my first question for you is, where did you grow up? And how was adventure and conservation a part of your childhood?
Oh, yeah. So I grew up a long ways away from here. I grew up in what is now considered the suburbs of Cincinnati, Ohio. I was raised in this little village. It was actually its own incorporated village back in the days, established back in that early colonial settler period of when Ohio was getting settled. And it's in southern Ohio. You would call it the Ohio River Valley. And this little village kind of got swallowed up as Cincinnati grew. What makes it unique, it sits on the banks of the Little Miami River, which was a major thoroughfare for trade and traffic coming out of central Ohio and connecting into Ohio to the Ohio River, and then also connecting into northern and central Kentucky. But my upbringing in the 70s and my early childhood in the 70s was quite idyllic. I lived in the two streets, both ended in a cul-de-sac. Lived a little bit up on a hill. It was a neighborhood. It was a subdivision. So nothing fancy about that. But behind our row of houses was a green space that when I was 7, 8 years old seemed like wilderness. When I go back there now, it's probably a couple thousand yards wide of this green belt. Coming right through the middle of our little neighborhood was a creek. there in Ohio. Those creeks were lots of clay deposits and fossils that you would find, trilobites in that era of fossils. And so this was, again, like in the 70s, and it was the time when I spent all my youth on my bike. I could ride anywhere I wanted in my neighborhood and also into the surrounding village to meet up with friends, to go down to the Little Miami River, where we would spend a lot of time just playing and splashing around the river. But a lot of our time was just in the neighborhood. In the summertime, my mom would often kick us out after breakfast and say, I don't want to see you until dinner time. And that meant me and my buddies. And it's worth noting, I'm the youngest of 4 boys, so I had 3 older brothers that showed me the ropes and how to get in trouble and not to get in trouble. And we just spent a lot of time building trails and forts up in the forest and being little, what we thought, explorers, going up the creek. Because the creek in our area kind of came through the neighborhood, and it was fun to go explore. But when you went further upstream, it really got into some more semi-wild country. It came into another community, very few houses, mostly forest. And so I'll never forget getting to the age of like 7 or 8 where me and my buddies were brave enough to go exploring outside of the neighborhood. And so we just felt like, oh, we're going to go and all day up this creek. And we did. We would go up all day. And on this one particular journey, one of my first journeys to kind of get out of our own neighborhood, I remember we would go up and we were finding all these amazing clay pools. Like, it was a creek, so it wasn't really high flow or anything like that. And it would trickle around, and there'd be these little swimming holes and pools. And we found this one that was super deep. It became our favorite swimming hole for the next several years of our youth. And then we finally ended up going further up, and it ended up in one of those culverts. And there's a small culvert, and it was a long culvert, and you couldn't see the end of it, so it was dark. And so that was the end of our adventures. We didn't really go much further than those until we got a little bit older, and it was a smaller one and we could crawl up there. And we finally, when we got older we went on some more adventuring up there and we got through it. But it was a perfect place for a young boy to grow up. And when I got into my middle school and high school years, I really got into sports. I was a particularly good swimmer, so I really got involved in swimming. I had probably the 4 best years of my education there. It was a Jesuit school, and if you know anything about the Jesuits, are really about service. One of our mottos was being a man for others, and it was a core part of our curriculum. And that became very important later on in my life, where this idea of service was why we're here, to live with a purpose. It helped growing up with mom and dad. They were in the Catholic Church, and that kind of reinforced a lot of that stuff as well. But when I got into high school, it was a really competitive swimming program. I swam year-round, and I carried that into my college years. I went into a college program and again swam. It was work, swim. Not a lot of adventuring and traveling. I spent one summer up in Maine, which was a pretty eye-opening experience, the first time away from really Ohio. I worked at a camp up in inland Maine, and I was into the sciences throughout this time. I was really interested in the sciences. I was studying biology and the natural sciences in particular. And I was way into the outdoors. That's where I was. My jobs that I did in the summer were landscaping and construction because I wanted to be outside. And my connection to the outdoors was more through this adventure, canoeing. When I was in high school, my older brother and I did a 3-day river trip down the Whitewater River. And it was a pretty calm river, but it was, again, we were looking for these adventures that were close to home, that were giving us this wild or semi-wild kind of experience. When I got to that summer up in Maine, it was a whole different landscape. We did a weekend trip to the coast, which was just mind-blowing. Never experienced anything like the Atlantic Ocean there. My dad one summer took us down to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And so I kind of got introduced to the national parks. We weren't the most accomplished campers, you could say. I remember my dad was really excited to introduce us to trout fishing. And so I'll never forget, being the youngest, I, of course, was dragged along and was the one to maybe hold everybody back. And sure enough, walking in this trout stream, we're looking for trout, and I fell in the river, got soaking wet. Cut the river trip short. We didn't catch any fish, but my dad was bound and determined that we were going to bring home trout to cook over the fire. So on our way back to camp, we passed a trout farm, and that's where we caught our trout for the night. And drying out all of our gear over the fire overnight. I'll never forget my Johnny Bench Keds. That's what we hiked in back then. And my dad made the fire too big, and my Keds melted over the fire. But those were just great memories. You know, we had a wonderful, wonderful family experience, and And again, that carried into continuing the story into college. I had a couple of those experiences, but when I was done with college, I'd given a good 8 years to my education in swimming, and I had a really nice job offer that was going to pay me well coming out of college, and I was like, not exactly sure I wanted to do that. Backing up again, during college, my dad took us out to Colorado and introduced me to skiing. And I was like, wow, this looks like a lot of fun. And I had a friend that said, hey, he was a friend that I spent the previous summer with. He goes, at the end of the summer, I'm going to go out and live with my uncle in Idaho and go skiing. And I said, well, I'm in if you invite me. And so we road tripped out to Idaho, and that was my first entrance into the Rocky Mountains. It really was the beginning of this path of another level of adventure and really conservation. It was kind of ingrained in me already, either through the Jesuits, through maybe church, my dad I know, mom and dad, this idea of respect and reverence for the natural world. They weren't by any means conservationists, but they were also like this humility, to live with humility. And I think that transferred well into my early experiences into the Rocky Mountains. But I was so wet behind the ears and green, I had no concept of public land. When I thought of the Forest Service back in Ohio, I thought I knew it existed. And I thought about Smokey the Bear and a park ranger. And I thought all the Forest Service lands were wilderness. They were there for recreation purposes. I had no idea about the logging wars that were going on out here in the West, the conflicts over grazing, development, all those things that were happening in the 70s and 80s. When I finally made it out to Idaho, it was the early 90s. It was the kind of the tail end of that. That was all new. But what really struck home when I first came to Idaho was, one, I fell in love with skiing and exploring the mountains in winter. I had my first experiences backcountry skiing, and this concept of public lands it tapped into that sense of adventure. There was so much to explore out here. And fortunately, I had the ability to be able to do that. I can make a living doing odd jobs here and there, doing seasonal work. And whatever free time I had and whatever money I had was committed to running rivers, learning how to fish, learning how to ski. And that was a good 3 years. I lived in central Idaho. And fortunately enough, in my second year in Idaho, I was getting restless. I was like, okay, there's more to being out here than this ski culture and this mountain culture, and I wanted to kind of explore some other areas. I met a girl who became my wife, and her name is Dulcie, and after a year of dating there, she was like, Paul, I need to go finish my undergraduate degree. I'm going to the University of Montana. And I was like, Montana, that sounds cool. Where's that? And so she said, yeah, well, I'm going to go. And I knew she'd say yes, but I said, can I come? And she said yes. And I was like, great, because I'm ready to get out of here. I kind of had fallen into debt. I had 2 cars that didn't run. So I worked 3 jobs that summer. I got both cars up and running. I sold both cars. I had money in my pocket, a good chunk for the first time. And I said, okay, well, that summer, I had an old Volkswagen van, and a 68 split window van that was too difficult for me to handle. I ended up having to sell it, unfortunately. We did a road trip up to Missoula because I wanted to see it, and she'd never been there either. And so, well, let's go see where we're going to move and find a place to live. And so we took that drive from Ketchum up over the Sawtooth, following the Salmon River, and coming into Missoula. And if anybody's done that drive, you know that's just one of the most stunning drives you can do. You follow this from the headwaters of Salmon, come up over Lolo Pass, drop into the Bitterroot Valley. We're coming up the Bitterroot Valley. We turned it into a 2-day trip. Your first entrance into Missoula, I'd have to say, it's not the best entrance when you come up Brook Street. It's a row of the mall, and it's strip malls, and coming from this idyllic kind of central Idaho, I was like, holy cow, what are we getting into? But we spent the week there and met some great people and just realized that this is going to be a neat place to settle down. So we made that move in early 90s while Dulcie was putting herself through school, God bless her, and it took a few years. And in that time, I fell into a great community of people that had the same interests that I did. If you live in Missoula, if you're into rivers, you got lots of rivers to explore. I got way into fly fishing, and me and my buddies, we'd take the boat, started learning how to raft the rivers. And we were, where are we going this weekend? And we'd go do multi-day trips on the Big Hole, and then over to the Beaver Head, on the Clark Fork, and on the Bitterroot, and fishing rivers. We weren't really as much into whitewater rafting, but we would float Rock Creek, the Blackfoot, and the Smith River. And I had some of my first experiences in true wilderness, hiking around here in this area, and then also doing those multi-day river trips. And I was skiing, of course. Snowbowl was my home in the wintertime, and had a couple epic winters of skiing there, and really got into backcountry skiing. This was when telemark skiing was really the way to explore the mountains. It was the lightweight gear, and I fell into a great group of friends that were kind enough to show me the ropes on how to explore the mountains on skis. And there was a couple winters there that was just some of my most favorite times, was being out in the winter in the mountains and learning how to ski out there. So I'm just kind of developing these skills, how to live out here. I was going to do something after Dulcie was done with school, and part of my idea was to go to graduate school. So I started taking some classes at the University of Montana. One of my first classes I took was an environmental education class with this great professor. That started really helping me understand what's going on our public lands and what it meant to have this kind of conservation ethic. And if you know anything about the University of Montana, the Environmental Studies Department kind of was like where Earth First kind of came out of. It was the hotbed of activism. I mean, these people were the ones that were out there fighting the fight to really protect some of these lands that were really being overrun by loggers and development, and really impacting negatively our streams and our rivers and things like that. And so it was just a great place to be in that community and be introduced into that community. One of the things I found about taking those classes, one of the things that resonated with me with taking like this environmental education and watershed ecology classes, I only took a few, but it was enough to say, like, you know, it's not my temperament to kind of be in your face. And the activism part, I really appreciated people could do that, but that wasn't going to be my space in the conservation community. I really liked looking at some of the things that were, what are the root issues? What are we going to do to change society? You know, how can we move society forward? Because I believe in society and our humanity, that if people spend time in these landscapes and develop relationships with them, that forms a common ground. And a lot of environmental education theory and this idea of, I started reading people like Aldo Leopold, who has a quote. And it's like, you know, I do believe that if we spend more time in our community, we will be more inclined to love and respect it. Richard Louv was coming out with some things, and John Muir, Barry Lopez, a lot of these great writers that were writing about how it's so important to have connection to place, and that is how we can probably resolve a lot of our issues that we have around land. So anyway, so that was going on when I was in Missoula. And then I had these couple summers with the Forest Service, and one summer in particular, I was hired to work as a biological technician doing eco data plots in the Central Rockies, and my home base was Choteau in the Rocky Mountain Front Ranger District. I'll never forget my first drive coming up the Blackfoot River and driving over Rogers Pass. And when you come over Rogers Pass, you kind of see the prairie out there, and then you come down and you cross the North Fork of the Dearborn River, and then it comes up on a rise, and it's your first rise, and it was a cleared morning, and you can look up to the north and you can see the Rocky Mountain Front Range like a reef. It's just like it comes out of the prairie. I'd never seen anything like that, where the prairie really literally rolls up. And I knew from where I was going to be that this was one of the last kind of places that the grizzly bears were moving out of the Bob Marshall into their native habitat, which was really the prairies. And so it was a wild country. And there was this big ranches and big farm, I mean, when I sat there for probably a half hour with chills up my spine. I still get that feeling when I drive over there. And so that summer, I really got into developing my plant ID because I was doing eco data plots. And so we drive these Forest Service roads all over the big belts and the little belts and the snowies, and some plots that we did on the Rocky Mountain front there. I just was hanging out with these great people, learning my plants and being a field technician. And I was like, yeah, this is good. I could see myself doing this for a while. But I really still had this nagging feeling about wanting to be involved in the conservation community. I wasn't sure if I wanted to really get into science and field research all the time. It's kind of seasonal work. I'm one of a little bit old-fashioned. I was kind of looking for something a little bit more stable. And at some point, I knew I was wanting to have a family. I think it was our 7th year in Missoula. Dulcie graduated and she finished her degree, and I found this program called Professional Residency in Environmental Education at the Teton Science School. And it was in Grand Teton National Park, and you could go spend a year teaching all the residential education programs that, the Teton Science School is a residential ed program where students would come and spend a week, and instructors would take them out in the Tetons and teach them about natural history, conservation, and then we'd also weave in some other things. I'll get to that later. But they started this new program where their faculty would train the new coming instructors, and those classes would earn you credit towards a graduate degree in either education or science. I said, looks perfect. And so my wife and I moved to the Tetons. Again, very fortunate. I mean, everything from having the upbringing from that my parents gave me and gave me the freedom to come out and explore and have the education and just the ability and the skills to come out here. And we didn't want to live on campus with all these younger grads. I was kind of older. I was in my middle 20s by this point. So we rented this yurt in the little town of Kelly in the middle of the Teton National Park. And we lived all winter in this yurt. And I really got inspired and found my first true mentors in the faculty there, because the type of programming that we were doing, I got even more steeped into the environmental education. And again, one of the neat things was that I was with a great group of young people that were really sharing the similar interests. And one guy in particular was a birder. I got my first pair of binoculars. I started getting into birding. I just kind of took these things I learned. I just learned the plants. I didn't know much else. The Teton Science School programming was about place-based education, which is basically saying, how can we teach language arts, math, science, and history by using the community around us, including the natural community. And these students would show up on campus Sunday night, they leave Saturday morning, and they were changed. We made a difference in these students' life. I remember as a class of instructors, we're not trying to turn everybody into environmentalists. We just wanted them to develop a connection to the land, develop a few skills, and maybe a spark. So when they go home, they have a little bit more confidence to go explore the woods in their backyard and take that with them. It found my purpose. And so at the end of that summer, I was like, either I'm going to go back to graduate school or I'm going to get a job. So that summer, I applied to the University of Montana. I got accepted to grad school, and then I applied to a few jobs. Lo and behold, the Nature Conservancy of Montana has a preserve up on the Rocky Mountain front outside of Shodo, and they were hiring an education director. And I applied for that job and got the job. And my wife and I said, let's move to Shodo.
We are sitting here in a light rain in the Bitterroot Mountains. And when I say we, I'm talking about Paul Belanger. He is an educator and guide, a naturalist, a travel professional, and the owner of Bitterroot Alpine Guides. So, Paul, I'd like to dive back into your story and, finding your dharma, finding your purpose. That's quite a gift. Not everybody in life finds that so early on. So where did you go to next?
A big part of my adult life now has been about this idea of connecting to place. And I was really inspired by my years at the Teton Science School, seeing how spending concerted amount of time with a mentor can really have an impact on young people and people in general, and me as well. So after that, I went up to this place that I fell in love with in the Rocky Mountain front in Shodo, and had this incredible, fortunate opportunity to work for the Nature Conservancy of Montana at that time, which was the only landscapes where the grizzly bear was moving out into its native habitat of the prairie. And they had a beautiful preserve there that went out onto the prairie, but also was kind of tucked back into one of the canyons, Teton Canyon there. And what was really special about those few years there was that I learned early on in this idea of connecting to place that there's multiple paths, there's multiple ways to connect with place. I did it through more outdoor activities and adventures, and later in kind of this naturalist education. People do it through art, people do it through work. Landscapers, ranchers, farmers. It doesn't matter how, people just connect with the land. And environmental education and conservation ethic kind of thinking, a lot of people like to believe that that's a common place. No matter what our differences might be, that there's common ground that maybe you can have a discussion from. And maybe we may disagree about, say, for example, should grizzly bears be on the prairie? But if we both care about the land, and maybe I can help you realize that maybe grizzly bears might help the land, and then I can learn from you that maybe they're not always in the right, it can go any different way, but this idea that there's a common ground. By the time I got to Shoto and the Nature Conservancy, they had been there, I think, for like 15 years, 20 years. The people before me that came before me had really broken down a lot of those barriers between the ranching community and the environmental community. And I was fortunate to step into that. And I was able to see how they had forged these partnerships with these people that knew way more about the land than I ever did or ever would, because they're third generation ranchers and they don't leave their ranch. And yeah, they're raising cows, but I learned, no, they're growing grass. Without the grass, they're raising cows. They love going out and seeing their cows, but they also love seeing that herd of elk move across their field. And there was a lot of shared values, despite maybe some of the other differences that we had. And I think the people at the Nature Conservancy and the ranching community there were brave and had forged these great partnerships. I was just the educator, so I had this great job where I got to take kids out to my preserve. And what the coolest part about this, Mandela, was that my classroom was an 1800s era one-room schoolhouse that was in the middle of this 8,000 acre preserve, sitting surrounded by the prairie and right up against Ear Mountain. And it was like 15 miles, I think 10 miles away from Shoto, up west towards the mountains. This is a big paleontological area. Museum of the Rockies was managing a piece of property that the Nature Conservancy, I think, owned at the time, called Egg Mountain, which is where they found the first dinosaur eggs. And so they had a camp there. And so I would hang out with these paleontologists. And one of my programs was to bring fourth graders out there and look in a bone bed. And like, what fourth grader doesn't love looking at dinosaur bones? And so it was like, from an educator's perspective, it was great. My classroom was this old schoolhouse that was loaded with skins and skulls. And I got to take kids on these hikes up to Pine Butte Preserve, up to the Pine Butte itself. And I'll never forget, I had this idyllic belief that I was going to change these kids' lives with their one experience. Public school kids came out from Great Falls, 2 buses. I had like 50 people and like 10 teachers, and we're going to go do these open inquiry program, and they're going to learn how to be little naturalists, and we're going to do these things. And I'm trekking them up this hill, and we're going up Pine Butte and at this trail. It's all in the open and it's side hills. And I remember getting near the top and looking back behind me, and it was 200 yards and I couldn't see the back of my line. And I was like, I'm not going to get anything done with these kids here. I was just so young and naive. And so we get up to the top of the butte, and I had some activities planned, and I was just like, scratch, as educators do, we pivot. And like, these kids just need to have fun and be out here. And that's where I kind of started learning, like, man, there's different ideas of what I can accomplish in this realm of education. If it's one isolated event, and this is their first and only field trip of the school year, at the end of the school year, you know what kids are like. They're squirrely as heck. They just need to be outside having a positive outdoor experience. Mm-hmm. The kind of experiences I was doing at Teton Science School, I knew I wanted to create those, but I wasn't probably going to be able to do it there. And so after a few years of delay in my grad school, University of Montana finally said, either you got to reapply or you got to come back and do your degree. I'm not one to leave things unfinished. And so Audubon Society had started an initiative to establish nature centers all over the U.S. It was a very ambitious plan to put in nature centers like within 100 miles of every citizen in the U.S. It's something grandiose. And the Audubon chapter and the state Audubon office was wanting to do that here in Montana. And the director of that program was a friend of mine. He said, well, Paul, come back and finish your graduate degree and come work for me. By that time, we had our first son, and we packed up our bags and we moved down to the Bitterroot. And that's when we first came into the Bitterroot. And this was in 2002. I was super stoked because they had just gotten a bunch of money to do more research around fire and fire ecology and people's perceptions of fire, because the year 2000, the people that were around at that time, they know like pretty much the whole southern third of the valley was on fire. Over 360,000 acres burned. Wildfire managers at the time were saying how it was probably some of the most dramatic fire behavior they'd ever seen in these fires. And we were just starting to come to terms with we've been putting these fires out and they've been needing to burn, and now they're getting so big that we can't control them. And so what the Audubon Society was interested in, some of the conservation groups, and then the Forest Service, was this growing awareness that fire is part of the landscape and we're going to have to live with it. And there's these perceptions that fire is bad and it's gone. And they were doing all these interviews with some of the residents in the Bitterroot Valley in 2000. And there was definitely trauma. People lost homes, and fire is bad in that sense. I mean, nobody wants to lose a home. Nobody wants to lose a livelihood. And the smoke and all the things going on, there was some significant trauma, but it wasn't gone. It was a step in the process of this forest and its cycle of regeneration and ecology and interdependence and so on and so forth. And a lot of people were interested in seeing how we can maybe shift those perceptions. And so Audubon had a grant for me to come down and do some education programs around birds and fire, because birds in particular are great to study because they fill lots of niches. And so if they're not in a niche that you would think they would be in, then maybe there's something going on that you need to look at. Well, with fire, lo and behold, there's a whole group of birds that really key in on immediate post-fire habitat. Everything from where it's nothing but standing black sticks and it's been burned, high severity fire, to mixed kind of intensity burns to light intensity burns. There's birds that are attracted to those areas. And so they hired me to come in and develop a program to study birds around citizen science. And the citizen science piece was really cool. This was like, again, early 2000s. And so my study was to develop monitoring birds in post-fire habitats with volunteers from the community. And it was this nexus between science and education. There was good education theory about the impact of having people out in the woods experiencing the natural world and how that can lead to changing perceptions and developing a connection and learning how to see things a little bit differently. The science community didn't think volunteers could collect valuable data that would contribute, and so I was trying to bring those together. My first 2 summers, that's all I did. I hiked in these transects that I created, and I was in these beautiful post-fire landscapes, and I organized these volunteers to do it. And I finished that study. The science part didn't come together as great as I wanted to. It wasn't a publishable data or anything like that. But the social piece was magnificent. It was really cool. It was exactly what I had hoped, is that when people went out in these landscapes, and granted, a lot of them were birders, so they already had conservation kind of sense, but a lot of them came in, admittedly, with this idea that these are dead trees. This forest is dead. After a whole summer of walking through it and seeing this abundance of life come up with the grasses and the wildflowers and the shrubs and the insects, and then seeing the bluebirds and the chickadees and the sapsuckers and the woodpeckers and the mule deer and the elk. When I asked at the end of the season, what were some of your most memorable experiences? Because we were out there watching these nests from beginning to end. They would say, I will never forget that morning when I was sitting there watching this one nest and this herd of elk came right across my transect. And, it was something other than the birds. And that was pretty awesome. Again, further solidified my commitment to working in conservation and education. And after that was over, Audubon had identified a nature center project in Belize, Montana. They wanted to develop this nature center with this group of people based in Billings that were turning these old gravel pits into an outdoor education center.
Well, I'm sitting here with Paul Belanger, and Paul, a lot of times people say, Mandela, do you really record on location? And so I thought this may be a good moment for you to describe how the weather's shifting and some of the plants that are around you right now. And this is the studio that we're in today.
Yes, this is the studio. We're up on the ridge, which is not always the best place when a storm comes in. I thought this was coming in tomorrow or tonight, but it looks like it's coming in now. And yeah, we're up in this canyon. And sure enough, on this exposed ridge, we have what looks like some snowberry that's around us. And then there's this beautiful little red flower, but this is like a pretty harsh, rocky environment. So this is where you got a lot of those low growing flowers that are well adapted to these harsh exposed. We're literally on a knife ridge right now. Off to our left is about a 300-foot drop, and off to our right is about another 300-foot drop. And we're up here with our trusty dog and weathering the weather.
And then looking down on the valley where you live.
Yes, looking on the valley, the beautiful Bitterroot Valley, and it is gorgeous. And it's a really neat nexus of agricultural community. It's losing a bit of its agricultural heritage, but there's a lot of people trying to hold on to it. I'm a firm believer in keeping the farmers on the land, and I hope they can stick around. But it's a beautiful view of the valley for sure.
Well, some of my best interviews on the Trail Less Traveled have been recorded when a storm's rolling in and I'm shivering. So this is a good sign.
Hi folks, my name is Chris and I'm the artist and co-founder at Explorer Maps. My brother Greg and I produced our first map about 11 years ago, doing the map of Montana, and our list of maps has grown from 1 to our current tally of over 65. I've been drawing and painting for a long, long time, starting as an advertising illustrator in the 80s back in Canada, to exhibiting wildlife and landscape oil paintings in East Africa through the 1990s. But I find that what I'm doing now with Explorer is the most rewarding project I've ever been involved with, mostly because it's a family business, and helping to grow that business gives me a real sense of purpose. We've even got our daughter Becca in on the action, making short documentaries and videos. She's just done one of Costa Rica. And my wife Ness will be finding new markets for our Explorer products when we move back to Kenya in the summer. So that'll be great fun. On the topic of connecting people in place, hopefully these maps bring back memories of great holidays and fun with family and friends. And it makes people want to get out there and connect or reconnect with these places. Do I have a favorite map? I definitely do not have a favorite map. They're all my favorites because they're like my children. I love them all equally. How's that for a diplomatic answer? Anyway, thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Vanessa, Chris's wife. Which map will you get to help you treasure your own special times? Please be sure to use the promo code Mandela for a discount when you visit explorermaps.com.
Paul, let's come back to the ways in which you're connecting with place here in the Bitterroots.
The trail that has led me to where I'm at right now, which is with Bitterroot Alpine Guides, and then also working with high school and middle-aged kids on doing trips to different destinations around the world. It started when I was in this project with the Audubon Society and building this nature center in Billings. Just an incredible opportunity to meet up and collaborate with a group there called the Yellowstone River Parks Association. And there was this incredible individual, Norm Shainthal, who I think most people in Billings probably know. He was an MSUB ecology professor. And he had this vision to turn these old gravel pits that were right along the banks of the Yellowstone River into an education center. He embarked on this process of recreating the different habitats found in that south central kind of part of Montana and planting thousands of trees and shrubs. He and a troop of volunteers, students, and so on and so forth. He also got some high school teachers to come down there and start doing some water quality testing and do some neat outdoor science projects down there. And they got to a point that they wanted to stay focused on their mission, which was developing a trail system from Laurel to Billings and parks along it. And they wanted somebody else to come in and run the center, raise the money for the center and build it and so forth. So that's where I came in. In doing that project, I tapped into another thing that I didn't think I was going to be very good at. I never had any training with, but that was fundraising. And I came in without the leadership of those people at the Yellowstone River Parks Association, the connections that they have, a lot of the leadership and talents that were at Montana Audubon, they all just converged. And that 6-year project resulted in a nature center building built and a suite of programs being offered, a board of directors being there, and I was just super stoked about it. And at the end, Audubon wanted me to be the director of the center, and I had 2 kids and had settled into Hamilton and didn't want to leave. And it was really for that reason. I love that project, and it was hard to walk away. I met an individual who started this company called Global Travel Alliance, and they do educational travel. And this great guy became another mentor of mine and hired me to kind of help them develop their science and outdoor programs. And so I now took my commitment to helping people connect to place and working with young people to another level, and that was with middle school and high school. And it was really one of the ways that I really got a lot of joy and appreciation out of this new endeavor was early on in my environmental education training, I had a mentor at the Teton Science School who introduced this idea of how do we connect with place. And I've heard this story or read it in several different places, but this friend of mine, Steve Archibald, he had asked the Shoshone elder, how do they develop their sense of place? Because Steve was interested in this idea of connecting to place and sense of place and place-based education. And the Shoshone elder went on to talk about this kind of concentric rings of place. One, when you're born, it's your family. There's the core, your immediate mom, dad, siblings. As you grow older, you can expand that into your, in their context, tribe. And that tribe becomes a broader context of relating to the world around you, and it grows. And then when you get beyond that, it becomes your community and your region, and then so forth. But there's always this grounding that comes back to your home family and your rootedness, and that's your sense of place. And I think that really kind of works throughout youth, where I was with working with middle and high school students. They're of that age. They're ready to move past their region and into the broader world. And I believe that's an important step in developing a sense of place. So it was great. So I started doing that with them, and I've been doing that ever since, and it's been wonderful. I've been able to guide in some of the most beautiful places in the world with student groups and see these life-changing, transformative experiences happen while they're snorkeling on the barrier reef of Belize and seeing sea turtles and rays, and taking a group of kids from St. Louis or New York City and bringing them into the Grand Canyon or Zion National Park, and really been fortunate to do that. I wanted to take these guiding skills and kind of do something new and kind of really try to give back, because the other thing I know that happened was, and it was kind of the pandemic that really kind of opened my eyes to it, is that we in the West were overwhelmed with people. It was the thing that you could do. That was great in the sense that that is what the natural world is there for us. That's one of the reasons why we need to protect it, is because there is sustenance we get from it, whether we know it or not. And whether you're coming from the city and this is your first endeavor into there, you need to have these wild places to remember where we come from. You know, that's what Leopold was writing about. That's what people like Lopez and all these other writers are writing about. It's like, you know, we are hardwired. That's the biophilia hypothesis. And we are hardwired to be connected to the land. And it brings these benefits to us, not just for recreation and enjoyment, but also mental and spiritual and other real benefits to you. And so I want people to be able to do that in a safe and responsible way. And when you're new and you come in, you have all these new people coming in, I thought it was an opportunity to provide some of those services. And I'm pretty humble with it. I just want to say, where are you? Who are the people that were here before us? The Salish and the Nez Perce and the Shoshone were here thousands of years before we were. And then how do you kind of move through this landscape with grace? And if you're interested, I'd be willing to share with you some stories about the land like we've done today. But really, it comes back to just giving them a positive experience. I hope people will come back and hire me to guide them for multiple trips. But at some point, maybe they don't need me anymore, you know, because they're comfortable with the bear spray and bringing the raincoat. Like we learned today on this hike, it was not supposed to rain today and get cold, and it did. That's why you always bring a raincoat no matter where you go in Montana. And so that's kind of what led me to Bitterroot Alpine Guides. I just feel very fortunate coming from this all-American blue blood upbringing in Terrace Park, Ohio, to being able to share this place with other people. It's real fortunate.
That's the voice of Paul Belanger, and he is wiping mosquitoes off his face as he speaks to me today on the trail in the Bitterroots. Paul, someone wants to find out more about Bitterroot Alpine Guides. How can they find out more about your services?
I kind of fly a little bit under the radar. I have a webpage, bitterrootalpineguides.com. Real simple, but that's my contact information on there. I have a growing social media presence with Instagram and Facebook, but that's probably the best way to reach me.
Paul, let's end your show with 3 bits of advice that you'd like to share with whoever's listening out there.
Well, it probably goes without saying, spend some time outside. No matter where you are. You can find it in Brooklyn, New York. I found it in Terrace Park. It doesn't have to be the kind of wild landscape like we are here. I mean, we're looking up Canyon Creek right here, and we're seeing the edge of the wilderness right there. You don't have to be in a place like this, but get out with a pair of binoculars to do some birding, with a sketchbook just to sketch your thoughts or write your thoughts down or sketch an image. Bring a friend when you do that. Learn about the history of that land, who was there before you. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned about that. And happiness is a choice, and it comes in a lot of different ways. Yeah, I think that's probably what I got to have.
Paul, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and energy joining me on the trail less traveled today, literally on the trail, taking me on a hike.
Well, thank you, Mandela. It's been a lot of fun. It's been fun learning your story, too. So thanks.
Namaste, Missoula, and my friends around the world. Mandela here, host of the Trail Less Traveled, the Trail 1033's locally harvested adventure radio series and podcast. The show premieres every Sunday night at 6 Mountain Time, and you can stream it live online at trail1033.com. If you missed the premiere, the show is a podcast available everywhere, and you can follow as we record on location around the world by visiting traillesstraveled.net. The Trail Less Traveled is dedicated to documenting humanity's first form of entertainment, that being storytelling. Adventure and conservation run parallel in this show, and every Sunday at 6, I'll be featuring an interview recorded with an adventurer and storyteller in their natural habitat. As of today, the Trail Less Traveled has been recorded in over 26 countries. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. And if the show has ever inspired you or made you laugh, if you've ever learned something by listening, my request is that you get informed, get engaged, and advocate on behalf of the wildlife and the wild lands in your area. My adventure tip this week is to check the expiration date on your bear spray. If it is expired or close to being expired, be sure to replace it and take this opportunity to practice spraying the bear spray. I'd like to end the show by extending gratitude to a small family business based here in Montana with roots in Africa. Explorer Maps offers hand-drawn maps of national parks, states, African countries, and our public lands. Learn about their hand-drawn story maps, storytelling community events, junior cartography classes, and outreach by visiting explorermaps.com. That's it for this week's adventure, my friends in Missoula and around the world. But until next week, please remember, living in Missoula is a privilege, and with privilege comes responsibility. Conservation is not a spectator sport. Get informed, get engaged, and speak up on behalf of wildlife and wild places.